And good morning, everyone. It is May 22nd, 2023. It is Monday. And welcome you all to today's live stream. Today will be an interesting one. As you can see, I am going through Tolkien's essay on fairy stories. A very interesting essay that he wrote in 1938, given as part of the Andrew Lang lecture, where he talks about, and it was given at St. Andrews in Scotland. This is, of course, there's a little introduction here, which I'm going to skip over. But he asks at the beginning, well, he asks in the introduction, I should say, that he says, we'll just read the last line here, the last paragraph. There are, however, some questions that one who is to speak about fairy stories must expect to answer, or attempt to answer, whatever the folk of fairy may think of its impertinence. For instance, what are fairy stories? What is their origin? What is the use of them? I will try to give answers to these questions, or such hints of answers to them as I have gleaned, primarily from the stories themselves, the few of all their multitude that I know. Now, he grew up reading all this stuff, and he was always interested in language. This is all how he came to write Lord of the Rings and Middle Earth and all that stuff that goes on in there. So this essay begins with him asking the question, what is a fairy story? In this case, you will turn to the Oxford English Dictionary in vain, he says. It contains no reference to the combination fairy story and is unhelpful on the subject of fairies generally. In the supplement, fairy tale is recorded since the year 1750, and its leading sense is said to be A, a tale about fairies, or generally a fairy legend, with developed senses, B, an unreal or incredible story, and C, a falsehood. As to senses, would obviously make my topic hopelessly vain, or vast. But the first sense is too narrow. Not too narrow for an essay, it is wide enough for many books, but too narrow to cover actual usage. Especially so if we accept the lexicographer's definition of fairies, supernatural beings of diminutive size and popular belief supposed to possess magical powers and to have great influence for good or evil over the affairs of men. He says that this supernatural is too dangerous and difficult a word in any of its senses. Cannot be applied to fairies. So that, doesn't help us. Diminutive size doesn't also not help us. It is more modern. And I believe, all of this came as the whole diminutive, elves being diminutive, and that starts in England. It's a sophisticated product of literary fantasy or fancy, and I think some of it is also French too, where elves, fairies are these tiny little people with wings, and Tolkien never really liked that. And I myself personally have never really liked that. And that is, again, it's more recent, more modern, going back to I think that he says 1700s. And so, yeah, none of this really helps when it comes to fairy stories. And he does say that fairies don't necessarily have to be in a fairy story. A story that has the essence of a fairy tale is a fairy tale, whether there's elves there or not. He says, fairy as a noun, more or less equivalent to elf, is a relatively modern word, hardly used until the Tudor period. The first quotation in the Oxford Dictionary, the only one before AD 1450, is significant. It is taken from the poet Gower, as he were a fairy, but this Gower did not say. He wrote as he were a fairy, as if he were come from fairy. Gower was describing a young gallant who seeks to bewitch the hearts of the maidens in church. This is a young man of mortal blood and bone, but he gives a much better picture of the inhabitants of Elfland than the definition of a fairy under which he is, by a double error, placed. So, he talks about in this essay how, fairy is, in a sense, fairy tale has to have the essence of fairy, and that includes forest and like wood and water and all the things that we know in real life. And then he gives examples of. I will give one or two examples of the expurgations I would perform. This will assist the negative side of definition. It would also be found to lead on to the second question: what are the origins of fairy stories? The number of collections of fairy story is now very great. In English, none probably rival either the popularity or the inclusiveness or the general merits of the 12 books of 12 colors, which we owe to Andrew Lang and to his wife. The first of these appeared more than 70 years ago, 1889, is still in print. Obviously, 70 in his time. In our time, that was over 130 years ago, right? It's old at this point. He says, most of the contents pass the test, more or less clearly. I will not analyze them, though an analysis might be interesting, but I note in passing that of the stories in this Blue Fairy book, none are primarily about fairies. Few refer to them. Most of the tales are taken from French sources, just as choice in some ways at that time, as perhaps it would be still, though not to my taste, now or in childhood. At any rate, so powerful has been the influence of Charles Perrault since his, and I'm not going to pronounce, I don't know how to pronounce that because I don't speak French. I have French ancestors. My grandma speaks French. I do not. I'm not going to attempt it. First Englishized in the 18th century, and of such other excerpts from the vast storehouse of the Cabernet, whatever, have become well known that still, I suppose, if you asked a man to name at random a typical fairy story, he would be most likely to name one of these French things, such as Puss in Boots, Cinderella, or Little Red Riding Hood. With some people, Grimm's fairy tales might first come to mind. When you look at these stories, there's no elves or fairies in these stories, but yet they're fairy tales, right? And he talks about, Voyage to Lilliput from Gulliver's Travels, and how that's not fairy. He goes through and gives these examples of what is not a fairy tale. Traveler's tales, beast fables, dream stories. These are not fairy tales. So when you think about, and he gives this example, Alice in Wonderland, not a fairy story, because they're framed as a dream. They're dream transitions, as he says. That's not. And then, like I said, he goes on and talks about the Beast Fable, like Monkey's Heart, which I've never read. I mean, I've never read a lot of fairy tales. Although I have read Grimm's fairy tales. I never did finish it, but they are very fascinating and darker than you would think. So they're not really for children, and he will go in and explain that later on in the essay as well, how fairy tales are not necessarily for children, but they're often connected with children. And so, yes, he goes and talks about, like I said, what is and is not a fairy tale. Origins is the next topic he wants to cover. What is the origin of the fairy element? Lands us ultimately in the same fundamental inquiry, but there are many elements in fairy stories, such as this detachable heart, or swan robes, magic rings, arbitrary prohibitions, wicked stepmothers, and even fairies themselves that can be studied without tackling this main question. Such studies are, however, scientific, at least in intent. They are the pursuit of folklorists or anthropologists, that is, of people using the stories not as they were meant to be used, but as a query from which to dig evidence or information about matters in which they are interested. And he talks about how, they will say, well, this story is actually based on this story. It's the same as this. Tolkien mentions the Black Bull of Norway and Beauty and the Beast, how they say that's the same story. But that he's not interested in unraveling, all the sources for stuff. And people have done that with even his writings too. He wasn't really keen to that. He sometimes people will try to figure out what something is, and maybe there is nothing there. You're looking for meaning where there is none. People do that. Even with the Lord of the Rings, look for meanings that are not there. Especially the leftoids who are trying to make it into this like communist, Marxist, hippie, whatever they're trying to do to it. And it is annoying, and I don't think he would, if he were alive, would be too happy with that, let's just say. But he says in this essay that, it's the that how the fairy stories are ancient. He says most debates depend on an attempt by one or both sides at oversimplification, and I do not suppose that this debate is an exception. The history of fairy stories is probably more complex than the physical history of the human race, and as complex as the history of human language. All three things, independent invention, inheritance, and diffusion, have evidently played their part in producing the intricate web of story. It is now beyond all skill but that of the elves to unravel it. And of course, fairy tales and mythology, all that stuff, because it's all connected, is based on real things, I believe. And it is connected to, as he says, language. Language and all that is all connected. When he wrote his stuff, his languages came first. And that's probably how it is for even fairy tales. The language came first. And they based stories about that, or on real life events, because there was definitely evidence of that. I do think myth is based on fact, and he does say that himself. And so, yeah, he goes through the rest of this, talks about what's their origins, right? He says, I might just back up and read the rest of what I was just reading. Might have missed something. I'm trying not to read the whole essay. I mean, it would take a long time, and I don't want the stream being too overly long. I will say before I continue that I am proud of my Christian themes and Tolkien's works video. Almost 300 views there. I'm very happy with that. And I am, obviously new to stuff like this, and I got far to go, obviously. But I hope you all enjoy it. And I am, as I enjoy doing it, and you can hear myself on my phone. I always like to check in case anyone shows up in the chat, and I can read that. But anyway, where were we? Okay. Of these three, invention is the most important and fundamental, and so, not surprisingly, also the most mysterious. To an inventor, that is, to a story maker. The other two must, in the end, lead back. Diffusion, borrowing in space, whether of an artifact or a story, only refers the problem of origin elsewhere. At the center of the supposed diffusion, there is a place where once an inventor lived. Similarly, with inheritance, borrowing in time, in this way we arrive at last only at an ancestral inventor. While if we believe that sometimes there occurred the independent striking out of similar ideas and themes or devices, we simply multiply the ancestral inventor, but do not in that way the more clearly understand his gift. Philology has been dethroned from the high place it once had in this court of inquiry. Max Muller's view of mythology as a disease of language can be abandoned without regret. Mythology is not a disease at all, though it may, like all human things, become diseased. You might as well say that thinking is a disease of the mind. It'd be more near the truth to say that languages, especially modern European languages, are a disease of mythology. But language cannot all the same be dismissed. The incarnate mind, the tongue, and the tail are, in our world, coeval. The human mind, endowed with the powers of generalization and abstraction, sees not only green grass, discriminating it from other things and finding it fair to look upon, but sees that it is green as well as being grass. But how powerful, how stimulating to the very faculty that produced it was the invention of the adjective. No spell or incantation in fairy is more potent. Tolkien was great at using words in his writings. Sometimes he would use words that are archaic and that we don't use anymore, but they're very beautiful words. And so I think what he's trying to say is that, I think I said this already, that everything that you can see out there, that you can describe, that's, a fairy tale's got to have that. It does not have to have elves. We can, in our mind, make mental images, and this is what we call fantasy. And that's what fantasy is. Tolkien did this. He imagined these things, and he took pen to paper, wrote it down. He became what he would call a sub-creator. So he says that an essential power of fairy is thus the power of making immediately effective by the will the visions of fantasy. Not all are beautiful or even wholesome, not yet at any rate, fantasies of fallen man. That definitely is true. There are people that envision these evil, awful things that they can do to people, and they go and do them. And he has stained the elves who have this power in verity or fable with his own stain. This aspect of mythology, sub-creation, rather than either representation or symbolic interpretation of the beauties and terrors of the world, is, I think, too little considered. True. And he goes on to talk about nature myths. So I wanted to talk about sub-creation, because it's something he talks about a lot. And he says this later in the essay, that we are created in the image of a creator, and so thus we create. We have that drive to create things. And man has created some really great things. But again, there's some really evil things that man has imagined. And in any fairy tale that you see, there's good characters, there's bad characters. Not everything is, rosy and everything's fine, everything's going to be all right. Look at some of the Grimm's fairy tales and how they end. Yeah. There's not always a happy ending. Tolkien's own story, Children of Húrin, that's a very dark story. And so he will talk about in this essay, where's my train of thought here? I lost it again. And so we go on to talk about children. Now, fairy tales are very often ascribed to children, but he'll say that that's not true, and that when it comes to fairy tales or fantasy, that the adult mind has more need of that than a child does. And you think about, what does a child have to worry about versus what does a human have to worry about? And so this also goes into escapism. What does a child really have to escape from? Homework. Oh, does this girl like me? Does this boy like me? Children's problems seem very insignificant when it comes to adults. We got something to escape from. Although, I guess you could say sometimes children do too, because some children are born into some very awful, awful, terrible families. They might want to escape from that for a while. So, but it's just fantasy fairy tales are not just solely for children. They can be for adults too. Lord of the Rings, I think, is not something a 6-year-old should read. Children of Hurin, definitely don't let a 6-year-old read that. That fairy tale is not for them. And then he talks about how children will always ask, is it true? And he's quoting Andrew Lang. And Tolkien says, they do ask that question, I know, and it is not one to be rashly or idly answered. That question is hardly evidence of unblunted belief or even the desire for it. Most often, it proceeds from the child's desire to know which kind of literature he is faced with. Children's knowledge of the world is so often so small that they cannot judge offhand and without help between the fantastic, the strange, that is, rare or remote facts, the nonsensical, and the merely grown up, that is, ordinary things of their parents' world, which still remains unexplored. But they recognize the different classes and may, like all of them, at times. Of course, the borders between them are often fluctuating or confused, but that is not only true for children. We all know the differences in kind, but we are not always sure how to place anything that we hear. A child may well believe a report that there are ogres in the next county. Many grown-up persons find it easy to believe of another country, and as for another planet, very few adults seem able to imagine it as peopled, if at all, by anything but monsters of iniquity. And I think that's always kind of funny too. We always think of, like, when it comes to like aliens or whatever, right? Oh, they're probably going to be evil, want to come down to Earth and destroy it. And you see these in movies a lot. That doesn't necessarily mean so. There might be peaceful aliens. Obviously, I don't believe in that kind of stuff. And I think that is a modern day fairy tale. Is there some truth to it? Yes, there's truth in all fairy tales. All mythology. Always a hint of truth. But yes, children always want to know if something is real. They're curious. And so, yeah, he goes on and talks about, like I said, about how fantasy is more for adults, not children. And then he talks about fantasy in the next section. Now, this essay, you can find it anywhere online. Just write it, look it up. I mean, WordPress.com has it, obviously. You can also get it in various books. So a lot of this stuff you can read for yourself. That's why I'm not trying to read the whole thing. So I'm obviously going to miss some stuff, but I do think it's worth reading. And so fantasy, he says, he talks about how the human mind is, capable of, like I said earlier, we can form these images in our head. Doesn't mean they're actually there. This is called imagination. And I know fantasy, I think at one point was not really considered real literature. People mocked it. And I think they kind of still do. And so he talks about subcreation. Like I said, how we are made in the image of a creator, and so we can create things like he has, but only we can't give life like he can. You start cloning things, and we have tried, God's going to be a little mad, because only he can put the spirit into the body. I gotta fix this. he talks about what a secondary world is, not what his Middle-earth stories are. It's a secondary world. Your mind can enter it. And yeah, there's going to be problems even in those stories that we have in real life. They might be similar, but it is a great escape for a while to go to another world. And how did the characters in these stories solve their problems? Can that be an influence on us? I think. And then he talks about recovery, escape, and consolation. Recovery is the regaining of something. Of course, escape, which I did a video on Friday about. And then consolation, which is the happy ending. And he coins the term eucatastrophe. And I said this last Friday, that catastrophe is always looked at as like a negative word, and it's really not. The true meaning of that word is a sudden turn. And so there's two types of sudden turns. There's decatastrophe and eucatastrophe. Decatastrophe is the bad turn. Then you have eucatastrophe, which is the good turn. Even the Bible has that. And he says the Bible is a fairy story. It has all the essence of a fairy story. But yet, here is the main difference. It is actually true. All that stuff happened, according to his belief. I've kind of had some things going on, and whether or not I still believe in the Bible and all that stuff, I'm kind of having a hard time with right now. Some things have happened. But so whether or not this is all true, I mean, who knows? But yes, the Bible is a fairy tale. Is it a true fairy tale or is it not? Well, Tolkien thinks it is a true fairy tale. Because again, it has all the essence of a fairy story, but is real. He says that fairy stories are not the only means of recovery, which is, like I said, it is the regaining of something. This is a very long essay. I have claimed that escape is one of the main functions of fairy stories, in which I do not disapprove of them. It is plain that I do not accept the tone of scorn or pity with which escape is now so often used, a tone for which the uses of the word outside literary criticism give no warrant at all. In what the misusers are fond of calling real life, escape is evidently, as a rule, very practical and may even be heroic. In real life, it is difficult to blame it unless it fails. In criticism, it would seem to be the worse the better it succeeds. Evidently, we are faced by a misuse of words and also by confusion of thought. Why should a man be scorned if, finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or if he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls. The world outside has not become less real because the prisoner cannot see it. In using escape in this way, the critics have chosen the wrong word, and as what is more, they are confusing not always by sincere error the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter. Just so, a party spokesman might have labeled departure from the misery of the Führers or any other Reich, and even criticism of it, as treachery. In the same way, these critics, to make confusion worse, and so to bring into contempt their opponents, stick their label of scorn not only to desertion, but onto real escape, and were often its companions: disgust, anger, condemnation, and revolt. Not only do they confound the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter, but they would seem to prefer the acquiescence of the quisling to the resistance of the patriot. To such thinking, you have only to say, the land you loved is doomed, to excuse any treachery, indeed, to glorify it. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with a prisoner wishing to escape and not thinking about prison. Nothing wrong with that. They may try to escape, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, who wants to be freaking in prison? But if you do the crime, then you should expect to do the time, obviously. But saying this is what these critics are saying, that you all just want to escape from reality. You don't want to live in reality. Yeah, maybe for a few minutes we don't. And so we're looked at as deserters, and yeah, that's awful. Yeah. Let's see here. I want to get to the part where he's talking about consolation. Oh, and he does mention the Great Escape from death. A lot of stories deal with that. We as man we know what's going to happen, right? We live and then we die. And many are afraid of dying. And so they will try to create salvation for themselves so they can live forever. This, in essence, is a fairy story. Fairy stories have to have this in there. Lord of the Rings, its biggest theme is death. Fairy stories provide many examples and modes of this, which might be called the genuine escapist, or I would say, fugitive spirit. But so do other stories, notably those of scientific inspiration, and so do other studies. Fairy stories are made by men, not by fairies. Obviously, because do fairies, elves exist? No. Obviously, they're not writing these things. We are. The human stories of the elves are doubtless full of the escape from deathlessness, but our stories cannot be expected always to rise above our common level. They often do. Few lessons are taught more clearly in them than the burden of that kind of immortality, or rather endless serial living, to which the fugitive would fly. For the fairy story is especially apt to teach such things of old and still today. Death is the theme that most inspired George MacDonald, who was a fantasy writer that Tolkien respected. He read his stories when he was a kid. I'm a big fan of that. I have not read any of them. I don't really know much about the man. I know he's a Christian. Most of these writers are. But the consolation of fairy tales has another aspect than the imaginative satisfaction of ancient desires. Far more important is the consolation of the happy ending. Almost, I would venture to assert that all complete fairy stories must have it. There has to be a happy end. Although, if you look at the Lord of the Rings, does that really have a hopeful, happy ending? I guess it kind of does, but then Frodo leaves. He basically dies. That's not how the story is supposed to end. But life does go on, doesn't it not? Sam and his wife have 13 kids. The Shire becomes more beautiful than it ever was. And so for the hobbits, yes, it's a very happy ending. And then he says that the true form of tragedy is drama. And then he goes in to talk about eucatastrophe, which is the highest function of a fairy story. The consolation of fairy stories, he says, the joy of the happy ending, or more correctly, of the good catastrophe, the sudden joyous turn, for there is no true end to any fairy tale. This joy, which is one of the things which fairy stories can produce supremely well, is not essentially escapist nor fugitive. In its fairy tale, or otherworld setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace never to be counted on to recur. And Lord of the Rings is chock full of examples of this. I believe the story of Theoden is one. Or am I thinking of the Battle of the Pelennor Fields? I can't remember. Yes, so again, the eucatastrophe, decatastrophe, as I already talked about. He says, let's see, it does not, the sudden joyous turn, the miraculous grace never to be counted on again to recur. He says, it does not deny the existence of decatastrophe, of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat, and insofar is evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. And so what did I say about the Bible being a fairy tale that's true? It has all the essence of it, because there is a sudden joyous turn. It's the resurrection of Christ. He dies, and it's just like, oh, well, he's dead. I guess that's it. But he comes back. Then he leaves us, but he promises he's going to return one day. And that is something that we can hope for and look forward to. And that is the happy ending of all of history. It is the mark of a good fairy story of the higher or more complete kind that however wild its events, however fantastic or terrible the adventures, it can give to child or man that hears it, when the turn comes, a catch of the breath, a beat and lifting of the heart, near to, or indeed accompanied by tears, as keen as that given by any form of literary art and having a peculiar quality. Even modern fairy stories can produce this effect sometimes. It is not an easy thing to do. It depends on the whole story, which is the setting of the turn, and yet it reflects a glory backwards. A tale that in any measure succeeds in this point has not wholly failed, whatever flaws it may possess, and whatever fixture or confusion of purpose. It happens even in Andrew Lang's own fairy story, Prince Pregio, I think I'm pronouncing that right, unsatisfactory in many ways as that is. When each knight came alive and lifted his sword and shouted, "Long live Prince Pregio!" The joy has a little of that strange mythical fairy story quality, greater than the event described. It would have none in Lang's tale if the event described were not a piece of more serious fairy story, fantasy, than the main bulk of the story, which is in general more frivolous, having this half-mocking smile of the courtly, sophisticated count, whatever that is. Count, I don't know. Far more powerful and poignant is the effect in a serious tale of fairy. In such stories, when the sudden turn comes, we get a piercing glimpse of joy and heart's desire that for a moment passes outside the frame, rends indeed the very web of story, and lets a gleam come through. 7 years I served for thee, the glassy hill I claim for thee, the bloody shirt I wring for thee, and wilt thou not waken and turn to me? He heard and turned to her. And this all includes an epilogue. He says that anyone that creates a secondary world, fantasy writer, sub-creator, they wish that what they're saying is real, that it's true to truth. It's derived from reality. That it has the inner consistency of reality. Now, are these stories true? No. Lord of the Rings is totally not a true story, but it is true to truth. And so he wants to talk, so he talks about how we should approach this from the Christian story, and which I've already mentioned, has the inner consistency of reality. There's the sudden turn. There's the aspect that it has everything that's in the actual world that we live in it. It has the happy ending that you have to have in every story. The happy ending we have not had yet, but is something that we can hope for, strive for, wait patiently for, because it's coming. Whether or not I still believe that or not, I don't know. I have been having some issues in my personal life. But ultimately, when this does happen to me, because it does happen a little bit from time to time, I always come right back to it, because there's always something in my head that says, this is true. There's a God. Jesus died. He rose again. He's coming back. God maybe has a plan for my life. And so I should be happy and be expectantly waiting his return. But that is hard to do. We are fallen after all. We are going to screw up, backslide, sin even. If you claim that you do not ever sin, you are a liar, because I know you do. And I love that he says in here, and I love this quote, God is the Lord of angels and of men and of elves. And somebody once requoted this and added, and of hobbits. Because in Tolkien's world, God is overseeing everything, and he created all things. So history, legend and history have met and fused. But in God's kingdom, the presence of the greatest does not oppress the small. Redeemed man is still man. Story, fantasy still go on and should go on. The Evangelium has not abrogated legends, it has hallowed them, especially the happy ending. The Christian has still to work with mind as well as body, to suffer, hope, and die. But he may now perceive that all his bents and faculties have a purpose, which can be redeemed. So great is the bounty with which he has been treated that he may now perhaps fairly dare to guess that in fantasy he may actually assist in the effoliation and multiple enrichment of creation. All tales may come true, and yet, at the last, redeemed, they may be as like and as unlike the forms that we give them, as man, finally redeemed, will be like and unlike the fallen that we know. I love how he ties all this stuff into the Bible, into God, Jesus, all that stuff. Now, the rest of this here is all the notes and stuff appended to this. I'm not going to go through all those notes, but I just wanted to kind of give an overview and maybe talk about this a little bit. Again, you could go to WordPress.com and get this. You can go to Amazon and order books that are in this. You have Tree and Leaf, which includes his story Leaf by Niggle, which expresses all of this. You can read it in, I think, Tales from a Perilous Realm is a book that you can get that this is in. The Tolkien Reader, which is an older book that you can get this in. There might be other places. I don't remember or recall. But it's a very, very good essay. Long, detailed. It would take me probably a long time to go through it all. And that's why I had to skim over things. And this is just something I'm testing too, because I'm not a critic of any kind or someone that reviews things. And I kind of would like to try and do more of that kind of stuff. Take everybody on a little journey, as it were. But that is all for that essay. I can unshare it because we are done going through it. But yes. Great essay. I highly recommend it. I highly recommend reading anything that Tolkien wrote. I know there is a book that's coming out, The Battle of Malden, which will be very interesting. But this has a lot to do with stuff not about Middle-earth. It's more, I think, scholarly in nature. Not everyone's going to find that interesting. I mean, some of that stuff can be dry and boring. It can be a slog to get through. Like there's one book I'm reading about his languages and stuff. I'm getting through it, but there are parts of it that are like, okay, this is dry, this is boring. You're gonna have that, but yeah. So anyway, that is all for today. Don't really have any news stories to cover because really not a whole lot going on right now. I know they just had the Bilderberg meeting, and there's all kinds of theories and stories and stuff about that out there. What's true, I have no friggin' idea. But possibly I will be back with the live stream tomorrow. I have no idea what I'm going to do. This is the one thing I have one other thing planned, and it's just an extension of a video I've already done about how this is the Tolkien wrote Middle-earth, all those stories as a mythology for England. And I just wanted to go through it all. And again, I like the history of Middle-earth, stuff like that, which I've done an overview of, but I kind of want to go more deeply into these things. So I got some studying to do, people. Maybe some more Christian-themed things coming down the pike. We'll see. Pipe, however you say that. I don't know. It's pipe. But we'll see what happens. So you all enjoy the rest of your day. And I should, hopefully I'll catch you all tomorrow. Until then, bye-bye.